Here is a number I need you to sit with for a moment. 96%. That is the percentage of the US dollar's purchasing power that has been wiped out since 1913, since the Federal Reserve was created, since the United States government handed control of the money supply to a central bank and told the American people, told you, that this was for your own good. Since that year, the year Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law, the dollar has shed 96 cents of every dollar's worth of value. What cost $1 in 1913 costs roughly $26 today. Not because the thing you're buying became more valuable, because the money you're using to buy it became less valuable, because more of it was created, because the supply of dollars expanded while your paycheck, your savings account, your retirement fund, all of it, sat there quietly, invisibly, losing ground. And right now, in 2025, that process is not slowing down. It is accelerating. The US dollar index, the DXY, the benchmark that tells you how strong the dollar is against a basket of major world currencies, just delivered its worst performance in nearly 3 decades, down more than 10% in 2025 alone. The worst first half of any year since 1973, since the oil crisis, since Nixon had already pulled the dollar off the gold standard 2 years earlier, and the chickens were beginning to come home to roost. Think about that. We are talking about a dollar decline so steep, so fast, so historically significant that analysts at Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, TD Economics, the biggest financial institutions on the planet, are all saying the same thing out loud. The structural bull cycle for the US dollar, the long sustained period of dollar strength that ran from 2010 all the way through 2024 and accumulated roughly 40% in gains, is over. The era of dollar dominance, as we have known it, may be entering its most dangerous inflection point in generations. And yet, the evening news moved on. Your bank didn't send you a letter. Nobody held a press conference. Because this is not the kind of collapse that happens with an explosion. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens the way Ernest Hemingway described going bankrupt in The Sun Also Rises. Gradually, then suddenly. We are in the gradually part right now. And the question you need to answer, today, not next month, not when it's on the front page, is whether your savings, your retirement, your financial future will survive what is coming next. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is not speculation. It is not fear-mongering for clicks. Every number in this video comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, Morgan Stanley Research, JP Morgan Asset Management, and TD Economics. The receipts are real, the data is undeniable. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly what is happening to your money, why it's happening, and what you can do about it. Let's start with the word nobody in Washington wants to explain honestly. Inflation. You've heard it 1,000 times over the past 4 years. It hit a 40-year high. It cooled down. It's back. It's complicated. The experts disagree. The politicians blame each other. And meanwhile, you're standing in the grocery store looking at a carton of eggs that cost you $1.80 in 2019 and now costs $3.50. And someone on television is telling you that inflation is basically under control. What they are not telling you, what they are specifically, deliberately, systematically failing to explain, is the difference between the rate of inflation and the level of prices. These are two entirely different things, and confusing them is exactly how you end up feeling like you're going crazy while being told the economy is doing fine. Here's the distinction. When inflation cools down, when the rate drops from 9% to 3%, prices don't go down, they just go up more slowly. Everything that was already expensive stays expensive. The baseline has been permanently reset at a higher level. And every subsequent increase, no matter how small, is calculated on top of that already elevated base. From August 2020 to September 2025, food, housing, and transportation prices rose nearly 30%. Not in 1 year, cumulatively. But the damage is the same. Your dollar, the same dollar you earned, saved, invested, now buys 30% less of those essentials than it did 5 years ago. Let me make this concrete. Ground beef is up 52.5% since March 2020. Beef roasts are up 73.8%. Eggs, the single most visible symbol of the inflation crisis in American kitchens, surged 86.5% from February 2020 to July 2025. Coffee, the thing millions of Americans consider a non-negotiable daily expense, has risen more than 47% over the same period. The average American household now spends nearly $700 a month on groceries alone. That number was dramatically lower just 5 years ago. And that's just food at home. Food away from home, restaurants, fast food, the lunch you grab at the deli near your office, is up an additional 3.9% in 2025, on top of years of prior increases. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. These are not just numbers on a chart. These are choices, real choices that real Americans are being forced to make every single week. According to a survey by the Century Foundation, nearly 2/3 of Americans switched to cheaper groceries or bought less food in the past year. Nearly half, 48%, tapped into their savings accounts just to cover routine, ordinary, everyday expenses. Not emergencies, routine expenses. The kind of thing that savings accounts are not supposed to be for. And those savings? They're already worth less than what you put in. This is the invisible tax. It requires no vote. It generates no debate. No senator has to stand up and propose it. It is levied automatically, silently, continuously, every single day that inflation exists above zero. And unlike every other tax in America, the invisible tax hits the people who save, the people who do the right thing, who live below their means, who put money away for the future, the hardest. Because the people who borrow don't mind inflation. Inflation erodes the real value of debt. If you owe someone $100,000 and inflation runs at 5% a year, in 10 years you're paying them back in money that's worth significantly less than what you borrowed. The banks know this. The government knows this. The U.S. Treasury, which carries nearly $39 trillion in national debt, absolutely knows this. But you, with your savings account, your money market fund, your nest egg sitting in cash, you are on the wrong side of that equation. According to research from Truth in Accounting, using Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index data, $100 in 1975 is worth just $16.40 in 2025. That is an 84% erosion of purchasing power over 50 years. $100 in 1950 was worth just $13.92 by the year 2000. An 86% destruction of value in half a century. And none of this happened by accident. It happened by design. To understand what is happening to the dollar right now, you have to go back to a Sunday evening in August of 1971. August 15th, to be precise. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and made an announcement that would permanently alter the global financial system and the daily lives of every American who would live from that moment forward. In a 15-minute address, he told the world that the United States was suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He called it a temporary measure. It was never reversed. Before that night, the U.S. dollar operated under what was known as the Bretton Woods system, an agreement crafted in 1944 at the tail end of World War II, when the United States held approximately 3/4 of the world's gold reserves and was the undisputed dominant economic power on Earth. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other major currency was pegged to the dollar. The entire global financial system rested on the foundational promise that if you held US dollars, you could exchange them for physical gold at that fixed rate. It was a constraint, a discipline, a ceiling on how many dollars the government could create, because every dollar created had to be backed by gold sitting in Fort Knox. By 1971, that constraint had become politically inconvenient. The U.S. had spent heavily on the Vietnam War. The Great Society programs under Lyndon Johnson had expanded the federal budget dramatically. The country had printed significantly more dollars than it had gold to back them. Foreign governments, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, who was deeply skeptical of American fiscal discipline, had begun demanding gold in exchange for their dollar holdings. U.S. gold reserves had plummeted from approximately 20,000 tons to just 8,333 tons, as nations exercised their legal right to convert paper dollars into the real thing. The math was no longer working. The system was on the verge of collapse. And rather than impose fiscal discipline, rather than cut spending and accept the political pain that would entail, Nixon and his advisors chose a different path. They chose to remove the constraint entirely. Since that decision, the dollar has lost more than 87% of its purchasing power. Housing costs have skyrocketed relative to incomes. Median home prices have risen more than 1,600% since 1971, while median household income has increased only 475%. The gap between what a house costs and what a worker earns has never been wider in American history. But the Nixon shock did more than just remove the gold backing. It fundamentally changed the nature of money itself. Before 1971, a dollar was a claim on something real, on a defined, finite physical asset. After 1971, a dollar became what economists call a fiat currency. A currency backed by nothing except government decree, trust, and the full faith and credit of the United States of America. And faith, as any student of history will tell you, is a fragile thing. The gold standard limited how many dollars the government could create. Once that limitation was removed, the temptation and the ability to create dollars without limit became structurally embedded in the system. Every crisis, every recession, every political emergency became an occasion to create more money. Because the downside, the discipline, the consequences, had been outsourced to the future, to the next generation, to you. This is not ancient history. This is the foundation of everything happening to your wallet right now. Now let's talk about the event that turbocharged this process to a degree that even seasoned economists described as unprecedented in modern history. COVID-19. In March of 2020, the global economy shut down. Businesses closed, supply chains fractured, unemployment surged. And in response, the United States government and the Federal Reserve launched the single most aggressive monetary expansion in American history. Between February 2020 and March 2022, a span of just 25 months, the M2 money supply of the United States increased from approximately $15.5 trillion to $21.7 trillion. That is an increase of more than 40% in the total number of dollars in existence in under 2 years. 40%. Let me put that in terms that make visceral, immediate sense. Imagine you have a pizza, 8 slices. You own 2 of those slices, 25% of the pie. Now imagine that overnight, someone adds another 4 slices to the pizza, but your 2 slices stay the same. Your claim on the total pizza just went from 25% to roughly 17%. You didn't lose a single slice, but your share, your purchasing power, went down anyway. That is inflation. That is what happened to every dollar you owned, every dollar you had saved, every dollar sitting in your 401k or your bank account between 2020 and 2022. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet, the total assets it holds, which expanded during quantitative easing as it purchased U.S. Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities, grew by approximately $3.3 trillion in 2020 alone. That single-year expansion was equivalent to roughly 1/5 of all U.S. dollars in existence at the time. And it didn't stop there. The Fed continued purchasing $120 billion in assets per month into 2021, keeping the monetary spigot fully open, even as the economy began to reopen and supply chains started to catch up. The result was inevitable. In 2021, inflation began to surge. By June 2022, the Consumer Price Index was running at 9.1% year over year, the highest level since November 1981. The Federal Reserve, which had repeatedly insisted that inflation was transitory, was forced to acknowledge that it was not transitory at all. It was structural, it was embedded, and it would require the most aggressive interest rate hiking cycle in decades to bring it back under control. Between March 2022 and July 2023, the Fed raised its benchmark interest rate from effectively zero to a range of 5.25% to 5.5%, the steepest and fastest rate hiking cycle since Paul Volcker's war on inflation in the early 1980s. But here is the thing that economists are careful to note, and that politicians never tell you clearly. Raising interest rates does not reduce prices. It slows the rate of increase in prices. The damage was already done. The 40% expansion in the money supply had already happened. Those extra dollars were already in circulation. The purchasing power of the dollar had already been permanently diluted. The rate hikes were damage control, crucial, necessary damage control, but damage control nonetheless. By 2024, headline inflation had cooled to approximately 2.9% by October. The Federal Reserve declared something resembling victory and began cutting rates. 3/4-point cuts in the fall of 2024, bringing the benchmark rate down from its peak. By 2025, it had cut a cumulative 75 basis points. But the cumulative damage from 2020 through 2024 is what matters. The Ludwig Institute's True Living Cost Index, a measure that captures the actual cost of basic American life more comprehensively than the official CPI, rose 31.3% cumulatively between 2019 and 2024, averaging 5.6% per year. The official CPI over that same period averaged just 2.5% per year. The gap between what the government's inflation numbers say and what Americans actually experience at the grocery store, the gas station, the doctor's office, the apartment leasing office, that gap is not imaginary. It is documented, it is measurable, and it represents a systematic understatement of the inflation tax that American families have been paying. There is one more layer to this crisis that most people either don't know about or choose not to think about because it is almost too large to comprehend. The national debt. As of early 2026, the gross national debt of the United States stands at approximately $39 trillion. That is 39 followed by 12 zeros. It represents roughly $114,000 for every single person in the United States, man, woman, and child, or $289,000 for every household. But those are just numbers on a screen until you understand what they mean in practice. In fiscal year 2024, the U.S. government spent $6.8 trillion and collected $4.9 trillion in revenue. The deficit, the gap between what we spent and what we collected, was $1.8 trillion, not in the aggregate over many years, in a single fiscal year. And for the first time in history, the interest payments alone on that debt, the money the U.S. Treasury pays every year simply to service what it already owes, exceeded $880 billion in 2024. That is more than the entire defense budget, more than the entire Medicare program, more than any other single line item in the federal budget, except Social Security. Let me say that again. We are now paying more in interest on our debt than we spend on the U.S. military. The debt has grown by $10.9 trillion in just the past 5 years. It has been in deficit in 92 of the last 125 years, and the spending is not slowing down. The One Big Beautiful Budget Act alone is projected to add $4.1 trillion to the national debt. Now here's where this connects directly to the dollar, to your savings, to inflation. When a government carries this level of debt and continues to add to it at this pace, it faces a narrow and unpleasant set of options. It can raise taxes, politically suicidal and economically painful. It can cut spending, equally politically toxic and genuinely difficult given the structural nature of the entitlement obligations. It can borrow more, which adds to the debt, increases interest payments, and makes the spiral worse. Or it can inflate. Inflation, the invisible tax, the option that requires no vote, generates no obvious victims, and lets the government pay back its debts in dollars that are worth less than the dollars it borrowed. This is not conspiracy theory. This is basic fiscal economics. It is the mechanism by which heavily indebted governments throughout history have managed their obligations. And it works for the government. It does not work for you. Because while inflation erodes the real burden of the government's debt, it simultaneously erodes the real value of your savings. Foreign holders of U.S. debt, and they hold approximately 25% of it, with China as the largest single foreign holder, are watching this with increasing unease. When a country prints money to service its debts, the value of the bonds those countries hold declines. The return on U.S. treasuries, when adjusted for dollar depreciation, becomes less attractive. And when foreign investors start moving capital elsewhere, as they have been, quietly, steadily, the dollar loses one of its fundamental sources of support. In 2025, foreign investors redirected a record $42 billion into European ETFs alone. That is money that is not buying U.S. assets. That is demand that is not supporting the dollar. The fiscal mathematics of the United States are, by the government's own projections, unsustainable. That word, unsustainable, appears in Congressional Budget Office reports, in the Peterson Foundation analyses, in the writings of former Treasury Secretaries and Federal Reserve chairs. It is not a fringe view. It is the mainstream assessment of the people who understand these numbers most deeply. And the implication of unsustainable, the word that everyone uses and nobody quite finishes the sentence on, is that something has to give. Eventually. At some point that nobody can precisely predict, in some way that nobody can fully control, the trajectory of U.S. debt and deficits will collide with the limits of what bond markets will tolerate and what inflation policy can sustain. We do not know exactly when, we do not know exactly how, but we know the direction. And the direction is not favorable for the purchasing power of the dollar you are holding. The U.S. dollar's supremacy in the global financial system is not just an economic fact. It is a strategic asset, a source of geopolitical power, a privilege that no other nation on earth enjoys. When you are the reserve currency, when the world does business in your money, when oil is priced in your currency, when central banks around the globe hold your paper as the bedrock of their reserves, you get to run deficits that would destroy any other country. You get to print money that other nations absorb. You get to borrow cheaply because there is always demand for your debt. This is what economists call the exorbitant privilege. But privileges can be lost. And right now, for the first time in decades, serious people in serious institutions are asking whether the dollar's privileged position is beginning to erode. Here are the facts. As of Q3 2025, the U.S. dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves had fallen to 57%, its lowest level since 1994. That is down from over 70% at the turn of the millennium. Still dominant, still the largest single currency in global reserves by a wide margin, but trending in a direction that ought to concern anyone paying attention. The DXY, the U.S. dollar index, fell more than 10% in 2025 alone. That is the steepest annual decline in 3 decades. The worst first-half performance since 1973. And according to Morgan Stanley research, this may not be a temporary correction. They project the dollar could decline another 10% by the end of 2026, as U.S. interest rates and growth rates converge with the rest of the world, and the tailwind that supported dollar strength disappears. What is driving this? Multiple forces converging simultaneously. The first is policy uncertainty. The tariff regime implemented in 2025, the most sweeping restructuring of U.S. trade policy in a generation, created genuine uncertainty about the direction of the U.S. economy. According to J.P. Morgan Asset Management, the dollar fell 1.2% in a single day following comments about the potential dismissal of Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, as markets interpreted it as an attack on the Fed's independence. When investors question whether the institution responsible for managing the dollar will be politically pressured, they move money elsewhere, quickly. The second force is fiscal concern. The national debt numbers we discussed in the previous section are not invisible to the global bond market. Foreign investors who hold U.S. Treasuries are watching the debt trajectory. They are watching the interest burden surpass the defense budget. They are recalibrating their risk assessments. And at the margin, slowly, gradually, they are diversifying. The third force is the deliberate effort by a significant portion of the world's economies to reduce their dependence on the dollar for trade settlement and reserves. BRICS, the economic alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a growing list of partner nations, has been explicitly pursuing what economists call de-dollarization. Not the dramatic overnight replacement of the dollar with some alternative currency, but the steady, deliberate construction of parallel systems. Bilateral trade settled in local currencies, yuan and rubles between China and Russia, rupees for oil between India and Russia, yuan real transactions between Brazil and China. A payment system called BRICS Pay, currently in development with full functionality projected by 2028 to 2030. Alternative financial institutions, the new development bank and the contingent reserve arrangement, designed to provide financing without dependence on the IMF or World Bank, which operate in dollars. Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the petrodollar system, the country whose 1974 agreement to price oil exclusively in US dollars was one of the pillars supporting global dollar demand after the gold standard was abandoned, has been quietly expanding oil sales in yuan, euros, and other currencies, particularly to China, its largest customer. Saudi Arabia has joined expanded BRICS. Saudi Arabia has explored cryptocurrency and digital currency settlements. The informal arrangement that has channeled global oil revenues into U.S. treasuries for 50 years is, according to analysts who track this carefully, gradually eroding. Is any of this an imminent existential threat to the dollar? The honest answer is no, not immediately. The dollar still accounts for approximately 88% of global foreign exchange transactions. It is still used in roughly 80% of global oil trades. The euro is at 20% of reserves, the Chinese yuan at only 2%. The dollar has no credible near-term replacement. But gradual erosion matters. A reserve currency that goes from 71% to 57% of global reserves over 25 years is a reserve currency in long-term decline. And a declining reserve currency means declining demand for dollars, which means downward pressure on the dollar's value, which means more inflation imported into the United States economy, which means more purchasing power lost by ordinary Americans. The direction is set. The speed is what remains uncertain, and the tariff situation added a new and particularly damaging dynamic. The Tax Foundation estimates that Trump's 2025 tariffs cost the average American household an additional $1,000 per year. Not in theory, not someday in the future, but right now, as higher prices on imported goods and retaliatory measures ripple through supply chains and land directly in your monthly budget. For a family already stretched by rising food, housing, energy, and healthcare costs, that extra $1,000 is not a rounding error. It is the difference between contributing to a retirement account and skipping a month. It is the difference between paying down a credit card and watching the balance creep higher. It is the difference between feeling like you are slowly moving forward and feeling like you are stuck or slipping backward. Put all of this together and a clear picture emerges. The dollar you are earning, saving, and trusting today is not the same dollar your parents grew up with, and it is certainly not the same dollar your grandparents knew. Its value is more fragile. Its purchasing power is under greater pressure. Its privileged status in the world is facing more serious challenges than at any point in the last half-century. You cannot control what Congress does. You cannot control what the Federal Reserve does. You cannot control what foreign governments decide about their reserves or how global investors price U.S. debt. But you can control how much blind faith you place in a system that has already shown you, over and over again, that the value of your money is negotiable. In the next part of this series, We are going to talk about what it looks like to stop being a passive victim of dollar decay and start becoming an active defender of your own purchasing power. We'll break down the specific moves ordinary Americans can make to diversify their savings, reduce their exposure to the invisible tax of inflation, and build a financial strategy that assumes the dollar will keep losing value instead of hoping it won't. Because hoping the dollar will somehow go back to what it was is not a plan. Building a life that can withstand what it is becoming is.